There is a long-standing story we tell ourselves about how the world works, particularly how the Western alliance functions. A story so deeply ingrained, it feels less like international relations and more like physics. Canada as the quiet neighbor, the reliable and polite partner to the north, perhaps slightly under-equipped but always willing since the War of 1812. The assumption has been that when the United States pivots, Canada pivots. When NATO calls, Canada answers. Sometimes late, sometimes with less money than Washington or Brussels would prefer, but always answering. Formidable, dependable bedrock of the transatlantic alliance, a country you never worry about, while attention is focused instead on Turkey, Hungary, Greece's economy, or Italy's political volatility, which is precisely why what just happened in Ottawa is not a routine policy shift, but a genuine geopolitical earthquake that has left officials in the Pentagon and at NATO headquarters in Brussels staring at their phones in disbelief, the kind of silence that follows a fundamental rupture as the Canadian government has taken a strategic military decision that challenges the architecture of North American defense as it has existed since the early Cold War, asserting sovereignty in a characteristically polite manner, but one that is deeply unsettling for American military planners, because while the headlines focus on procurement and borders, the real story is independence, a recognition by Canada that its strategic interests are no longer perfectly synonymous with those of its superpower neighbor or its European allies. After years of mounting pressure in which American presidents from both parties repeatedly urged Canada to meet the 2% of GDP defense spending target and accused it of free riding under the U.S. security umbrella, pressure that Canada traditionally answered with diplomatic assurances, future funding promises, and limited purchases designed to ease tensions without altering the underlying economic reality, until this time when the response was not an apology but a hard pivot centered on the Arctic, now understood not as a remote wilderness but as the next major contested theater of naval and air power, where Russia is entrenched, China calls itself a near-Arctic state, and the United States has long assumed Canada would fully integrate its northern defenses into American and NATO command structures, even effectively deputizing U.S. and allied forces to help patrol the Northwest Passage TIFA add-in. Acknowledging that the threat was simply too large for Canada to manage alone. That was the script and that was what everyone expected. But instead, the Canadian government announced a massive independent strategic investment that keeps command and control of the Arctic firmly and exclusively in Canadian hands, while deliberately sourcing technology and infrastructure in ways that prioritize domestic sovereignty over NATO interoperability, effectively telling the United States and the alliance that the Canadian North is not a NATO flank, but sovereign Canadian territory to be defended on Canadian terms, even if that means breaking with the standardization and integration long demanded by the U.S. military. A move best understood as the quiet neighbor not merely building a fence, but hiring private security and informing you that your police have no jurisdiction on their property, a step that matters because it breaks an unwritten rule of the alliance that interoperability comes first. That in a crisis, everyone uses the same systems, yet by walling off a vast and strategically vital region from automatic allied access, Canada is redefining what alliance actually means, insisting that partnership does not equal submission at a moment when the Arctic is melting, opening shipping lanes and resource zones worth trillions of dollars, while Russia builds bases, China expands its icebreaker fleet, and American strategy has long assumed Canada would function as a staging ground for U.S. assets, an assumption now shattered, prompting carefully worded and diplomatically calm statements from Washington, even as off-the-record conversations and the sudden rush of meetings at the State Department and Pentagon revealed genuine shock that Ottawa possessed both the political will to spend at this scale and the resolve to do so in a way that effectively sidelines the American military-industrial complex, marking a level of national interest assertion not seen from a Canadian government in generations, and forcing the United States to confront an uncomfortable question. What happens if allies stop waiting for American leadership, look at political chaos in Washington, budget uncertainty and foreign policy volatility, and decide they need an insurance policy against the United States itself? A question whose answer lies in the money, in the flow of defense dollars, and in decades of Canadian procurement failures marked by aging aircraft, rusting ships, and canceled contracts. Failures rooted not simply in incompetence, but in a structural tension between buying American off-the-shelf systems that satisfy Washington while exporting jobs south, and building a domestic defense industry that creates jobs at home but costs more, takes longer, and until now was deemed too risky to pursue at scale. For 50 years, Canada tried to split the difference and ended up with the worst of both worlds, but this decision signals that era is over, as Ottawa is choosing the domestic route at an unprecedented scale,